The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Well, who knew that today it would be NFL football at the center of a major controversy involving Donald Trump? And I guess this sort of started to blow up a few days ago when Donald Trump called NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick a son of a bitch because he has been peacefully protesting by not standing during the national anthem, which is played before NFL football games. And there's just so much wrong with every aspect of how this has absolutely exploded. And even before this specific kneeling at the anthem thing became an issue, there have been debates about free speech that have become incredibly polarized and really pretty unhinged in the U.S. And there's a few reasons why that's been going on. Number one, and we've talked about this, is the major confusion around what the First Amendment actually means. Usually, the First Amendment is not at all a factor in the conversations people have about free speech. And for more about that specifically, you can check out my interview with attorney Burt Newborn, who's an expert on the First Amendment. That's on YouTube and in the archives for our members. Even when we can get past the issue of the First Amendment, there is still confusion from people about the right to speak whenever you want and wherever you want versus being, quote, censored. Now, as an example of where people don't understand that, just because you have a particular college that sometimes has speakers doesn't mean that they have to have you as a speaker to avoid being the practicers of censorship or violations of free speech. No one has a right to speak at any college that they want to. And even when we can get past that confusion, there's still a total misunderstanding of the reality that free speech is not freedom from the consequences of that speech. You might be able to say whatever you want, but there can be consequences to doing so, and that's okay also. Now, shockingly, the Colin Kaepernick thing has blown up despite not really being controversial at all. I mean, in the United States, there's nothing legally wrong with not standing during the national anthem. There's nothing morally wrong with it either, as that is sort of the prototypical nonviolent protest type that I thought our country was founded upon. And one argument is, well, Colin Kaepernick is being disrespectful to the military members who fight for our flag. No, they fight for us to have a country where people can express opinions, like Kaepernick is doing by kneeling during the national anthem. And the height of hypocrisy is the people who complain about oppressive political correctness, and then they say Kaepernick should be fired for kneeling during the anthem because that's wrong. Demanding someone stand during the anthem is the same type of heavy-handed, normative political correctness that the same people claim to oppose. So anyway, Trump is full in with this nonsense, gave a speech in Alabama, and he went off topic into a rant about the NFL and referred to players who kneel during the anthem as sons of bitches. Take a look at this.
I and everyone in this arena tonight are unified by the same great American values. We're proud of our country. We respect our flag. Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired.
Yeah. Now, remember that, according to Trump, there were fine people on both sides of the neo-Nazi rally, yet NFL players who kneel as a sign of activism are sons of bitches, which is also calling their mothers bitches, which is probably not that surprising coming from Donald Trump. There are fine people fighting for racial separation, and the sons of bitches are the ones activating against racial inequality.
Also, you got to love it when Trump is wrong on multiple levels. So, of course, there's the level that you laid out there. But also, Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback whom a lot of this focus and drama is centered around, doesn't have a job right now.
He's not even in the NFL.
He's a pretty good quarterback by all objective measures. The whole reason that he's a free agent is because no team will sign him because they're afraid of the backlash that's going on.
No doubt about it. And many NFL players are not happy with this. A ton of them tweeting over the weekend. New England Patriots owner Bob Kraft, who's known to be a friend of Donald Trump's, put out a statement slamming these comments. The NFL commissioner Roger Goodell's office did the exact same thing. You had Jaguars and Ravens players kneeling during the anthem in response to Trump's criticism. 20 of the New England Patriots took a knee, countless NFL players, hundreds of players total. The NFL, consider for a moment, is a totally militaristic, corporatist, and by and large right-wing haven in terms of its ownership structure. And they're more or less unifying against the comments from a Republican president. Consider what that means. Even recalcitrant elements of the Republican Party have been speaking out in favor of the players and against Donald Trump. And this is moronic nonsense in a number of ways. First is ideologically, then is Trump's hypocrisy, which is often there. As I mentioned already, the right complains about blacklists against conservatives in different industries or in Hollywood or at Google, and then they want people fired for expressing political opinions through nonviolent action. It's sort of a blacklist for anyone who kneels during the national anthem. Does anybody see the glaring hypocrisy here? Then they complain about oppressive political correctness, but again, say that you should be required to stand during the anthem because it's wrong not to and it's disrespectful. This is enforcing their own version of political correctness. And this may come as a shock to some people in our audience, Pat. You cannot be a fan of this protest method, kneeling during the anthem, but recognize that it is absolutely the type of nonviolent political speech that that the country was founded on, and recognize that the president dictating people be fired for it is absolutely atrocious.
And he also went after the NBA this weekend, too, because apparently he had nothing better else to do. And he said that usually after an NBA team wins a championship, they go to the White House, and there's this whole big ceremony and everything.
Of course.
He rescinded that invitation for the Golden State Warriors.
Right.
So, of course, you know, the Players Association is behind them. LeBron James called him a bum.
I saw that on
Twitter. It's just a bad political strategy, too, because a lot of people in the middle of the country love their sports more than they love politics. They're going to choose the Warriors and Kaepernick over Trump, I think.
For the most part, I think you're right. And Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, I don't know if you saw it, Pat, but he had an amazing 90-second comment about all this. And I mean, it just... I don't know who Trump's picking a fight with. And the argument I saw from a defender of Trump was, listen, people have been polled about whether they support kneeling during the national anthem. And something like 60 to 80% of Americans believe it's wrong to kneel during the national anthem. Thus, Trump is actually on the right side of this. You can be against kneeling during the national anthem, but still recognize that it's constitutionally protected and it is the right of whoever is choosing to do that and not to be fired for it. And I think that's where maybe Trump is misreading it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people understand that it's just a symbol, it's just a song, but to those who think that it's more valuable and important than that, I think they understand as well that this wouldn't get much of attention if he was to do it in some other way, if he was to protest when the cameras weren't rolling, when the national anthem wasn't playing. There's no way we would be talking about this right now.
And by the way, what's the point of fighting for our freedoms around the world with the military, all that stuff, if then people don't get to choose how they use that freedom however they want? And this is the president calling for the firing of employees of private businesses. That's not exactly the freedom that I thought the right wanted. And then, of course, Pat mentioned this earlier, when it comes to Trump and respect and service, Trump is framing his position here as the moral position, as the patriotic position, its duty to country and respect for our troops. Trump attacked the Gold Star family. Trump said he didn't think a former prisoner of war, Senator John McCain, was a hero because he was captured. And according to McCain, over the last 24 hours, he's never apologized to John McCain for that. Trump said that avoiding STDs through risky sexual encounters with women was his own Vietnam. And Trump avoided the draft multiple times because of bone spurs that he couldn't even remember in which foot he had them when asked about it years later. And it's often Trump who's doing the not patriotic thing when there's a flag or anthem around. Remember at a Republican debate when Donald Trump did not have his hand over his heart. It was Trump during the Pledge of Allegiance or anthem or whatever it was. Marco Rubio had his hand on his heart. Ted Cruz had his hand on his heart. Ben Carson, who usually sleeps through these things, had his hand on his heart, but not Trump. Trump doesn't know or admit to even knowing why these players are taking a knee. He claims it's disrespectful to law enforcement and the military. What about flying the Confederate flag? Isn't flying the Confederate flag as disrespectful to the actual flag of the United States as just kneeling during the anthem? And the last point I want to make on this, Trump's coming for your health care, right? Trump's coming for your health care, and he sends a dozen tweets about kneeling during NFL games. Trump's been silent on Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, we're talking about Americans in Puerto Rico who have no power. They are lacking water after getting hit with 2 hurricanes. And instead of a dozen tweets about how Trump is going to help Puerto Rico, it's a dozen tweets about athletes kneeling during the national anthem.
And remember, he made these comments when he was endorsing the Alabama Senate contender, Luther Strange, too. Yeah. Complete ad lib here.
Yeah. Oh, and it seems that anytime Trump comes up with these little ideas, they end up completely imploding. And we know enough about Trump's personality to assume he thinks he's right in all this. Bob Kraft, 200 players, this, that, the other person saying, yeah, Trump's just wrong about this. Trump will rationalize it and say, no. Here's why I'm actually the one who's correct. And the truth is, there are enough people in this country who side with Trump and don't understand the nuances of the First Amendment and of free speech and of censorship and of private companies being able to make the employment decisions that make sense for them, that this may actually not be something that really drags down Trump's approval rating. We'll see. It's actually, shockingly, I mentioned last week that Trump's approval rating has sort of ticked up a little bit. It's ticked up a little more, now up to 40% as of this morning in the Gallup daily tracking poll. But we will see what those numbers look like closer to the end of the week. Okay, I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show's on Twitter at David Pakman Show. What do you think of all this? What's really the core issue that is at play in Trump's criticism of kneeling during the national anthem?
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Joshua Gibbons. Joshua, thank you for supporting our program. We do depend on the support of viewers and listeners like Joshua, and I encourage you to throw in $1 or $2 a month. You can do so at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Membership is an option at davidpakman.com/membership. You can also shop on Amazon after going to davidpakman.com/Amazon. That will support us with every single Amazon purchase that you make. The situation with North Korea is not showing any signs of de-escalating anytime soon. Donald Trump continues to throw these sort of belligerent and erratic threats towards North Korea, and once again, casually threatening genocide of the North Korean people on Twitter, where he wrote over the weekend, just heard Foreign Minister of North Korea speak at UN. If he echoes thoughts of Little Rocket Man, they won't be around much longer. And of course, what Donald Trump is referencing here was a speech by the North Korean foreign minister, Ri Yong-ho, who earlier the same day called Trump a, quote, mentally deranged person full of megalomania who is holding, quote, the nuclear button. Happens to be a perfectly accurate assessment of Donald Trump. Not to cheerlead anything North Korea does. We have our fair share of criticism for North Korea, but it seems to be a sort of accurate assessment. Remember last week at the United Nations when Donald Trump had the following to say.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Yeah. So after that, a bunch of people wrote to me. They said, David, you're not telling the truth. That's not a threat of genocide. That's just fake news. Is it? Let's examine. Genocide, of course, defined as the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular ethnic group or nation. Saying you will totally destroy North Korea, or that, as he said over the weekend, that North Korea won't be around much longer, is saying you're going to destroy a large group of people from a particular nation. It is a de facto threat of genocide. And I believe this is a loser's battle for Trump because North Korea is led, as we know, by an erratic megalomaniac, Kim Jong-un. The U.S. is also led by an erratic megalomaniac where, and if we imagine erratic megalomaniacs getting together, it's usually not good for the average person. And North Korea is not backing down. They are keeping up the military threats despite the warnings from Trump. The minister of North Korea, the foreign minister, says that this tweet from Donald Trump was a declaration of war and that it now justifies military action against American military assets, even outside of North Korean airspace. You need an adult in the room. It used to be Obama, and there's no adult in the conversation right now.
So just on this definitions point about genocide, it did strike me at first as maybe not the most appropriate term, but then you take a look at that definition and you think that, well, I think usually it's because you think of a genocide as something that a government does internally, some say like the Holocaust,
Sure.
the Armenian genocide, Darfur, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. When you talk about a nation that's being targeted, when you talk about a political entity that's being targeted, I think that fits quite appropriately.
I think the term absolutely applies, and it's what Donald Trump is threatening on Twitter. We have a president in 2017 who is threatening the wholesale destruction of a nation on Twitter. And Kim Jong-un is bananas, right? I mean, the guy's executed members of his own family, never mind countless civilians. He may well be geopolitically suicidal, maybe not, but the last thing you want is someone else who's just as much of a hothead opposing that outrageous hothead megalomaniac. Trump doesn't seem to have any ability to calm down. Pyongyang just released more videos showing U.S. planes and an aircraft carrier under attack. So it's all escalating. And there's a very disturbing article from the New Yorker which puts this fiasco into context. And it points out there's never been a moment in history when you had two national leaders, both of whom have nuclear weapons at their disposal. And it's the geopolitical equivalent of a penis-size contest. Now, you might hear me say this and say, okay, well, David, listen, Trump's nuts. Kim Jong-un is nuts. But how do you deal with North Korea right now? The threats don't seem to work. The sanctions barely seem to work. Leaning on China doesn't seem to work. So then what do you do? There aren't really what one would call good options, particularly when the more threats that North Korea receives from other countries, the more they seem justified in their desire for nuclear weapons. There's one analysis in The Atlantic by Mark Bowden, who says, listen, because the options are bad, you've got, a huge strike to totally destroy North Korea, a more strategic strike, which also has issues associated with it. Huge sanctions mostly hurt the people of North Korea who we're trying to help. What about the give it time strategy? And what Mark Bowden means is maintain the status quo. Yes, Kim Jong-un can advance development of weapons, but he can't really use those weapons unless he wants to commit instant suicide, right? If and when he uses a nuke, he is assuring his own destruction. And Bowden argues, listen, if the Kim family were that crazy, they'd probably have taken some action under a previous administration. They're now in their third generation of rule by the dictatorial Kim family, and they seem to have some control over themselves. That's one idea. Another idea is from someone I'm actually not a fan of. Remember former Bush lawyer John Yoo involved in this viral video where he refused to answer John Conyers' questions about whether the president could legally order a prisoner be buried alive during questioning? John Yoo says, cut the status quo and cyber hack your way to a solution. He says use technology to cripple the North Korean regime. And some of the ideas that John Yoo has are freeze the assets of North Korean companies, leaders, everyone in banks around the world, because there are North Korean companies and individuals that do have assets around the world. Freeze them. Hack into and disrupt companies that do business with North Korea. Start using drones in any number of ways. Jam North Korean satellites in space. I don't know whether these would be considered peaceful tactics. In the 21st century, those are probably acts of war. But the idea is make it clear to North Korea that they're outmatched by crippling their access to funds and technology, which they do need. And I'm not a fan of John Yoo, But it's an interesting suggestion that he wrote about.
And we've heard over and over again that there's really no good military option when it comes to North Korea.
Yeah.
So I think any third way, like those that John Yoo was pointing out, it's a good idea at least to think about. I actually saw a poll out of NPR asking Americans if the U.S. president wanted to launch a nuclear strike, would he have to go get approval from Congress first? Would he have to consult with Secretary of Defense or any of his military generals? And a plurality of people thought that he would have to get congressional approval, which isn't true. If Trump decides to do it tomorrow, he's doing it tomorrow.
Yeah, and of course, it would be personally hypocritical because Trump was the guy when Obama was president saying, oh, no. President Obama can't even be threatening to do the things he's considering doing in Syria and in other situations. But we know that if Trump makes the decision, Trump is going to do it. I think that this is a very interesting situation that we're finding ourselves in with North Korea. Whatever the solution, though, Trump's not the guy I want at the helm. Trump's not the guy I want trying to figure it out. There's every indication that things aren't good in Donald Trump's marriage, but I don't really care about that. What I do care about is whether Melania Trump is being held sort of like a hostage during the presidency. Remember this incident from the inauguration. We did this story. It got almost 4 million views on YouTube, where during the inauguration, Donald Trump turns to a smiling Melania Trump, says something, and then she seems absolutely miserable. And we speculated, what did Donald Trump say that crushed Melania's soul in this way? It was absolutely bizarre. This new one I have for you is probably even stranger. Donald Trump traveled all the way down to Fort Myers, Florida to do what I call hurricane politics or whatever, right? Show his face after the hurricane. He's in Fort Myers. He's standing between Mike Pence and Melania Trump, his wife, right? And he says, Melania really wanted to be here today. Melania really wanted to be here today. And of course, Melania Trump is next to Donald Trump. Let's take a first pass through the video and the audio.
Even imagine. And down here, the same thing. So I want to thank everybody. You guys, I don't want to see you next week at another place, okay? We've seen you enough. But I just want to thank everybody, the first responders, on behalf of myself, our vice president. Melania really wanted to be with us. It's really touched her heart what's gone on. And we've seen the devastation. We're going to see some more of it now, unfortunately.
Now, when Donald Trump does this, there's two things to look at. First is that Marco Rubio over Trump's right shoulder looks very, very confused. And then it's that Melania Trump also initially doesn't react, but then does by looking off to her left sort of strangely. It appears that someone was maybe patting her on the back. She appears emotionless. Trump appears emotionless speaking about her. And it's not clear whether Donald Trump knows Melania Trump is next to him. I'm going to play it for you just one more time. Let's look at it together.
Even imagine. And down here, the same thing. So I want to thank everybody. You guys, I don't want to see you next week at another place, okay? We've seen you enough. But I just want to thank everybody, the first responders, on behalf of myself, our vice president. Melania really wanted to be with us. It's really touched her heart what's gone on. And we've seen the devastation. We're going to see some more of it now, unfortunately.
The look on Marco Rubio's face is just priceless. So what's the defense here, right? I mean, did Trump forget that his wife was not only with him on the trip, but standing next to him after traveling down to Florida from Washington, D.C.? The defense is when Trump said she really wanted to be here today, he meant she is here because she wanted to be here and she's very happy about being here. But it's a very strange way to talk. And it's also weird that if Trump is aware that Melania Trump is right next to him, that when he says Melania Trump really wanted to be here, that he wouldn't maybe look in her direction or put his arm around her or signal to Melania Trump. It is downright bizarre behavior.
It is a little strange because he references Mike Pence and he kind of makes a gesture to him.
Correct.
But then he references Melania and he doesn't do the exact same thing.
And he uses very different language to refer to one and the other.
Right. But at the same time, it's not like he said Melania would have liked to come here. It's not conditional tense in the same way. I mean, she wanted to come here and she is.
If you're calling it a poor choice of words, though, native speakers of American English don't speak this way when they're standing next to the person who really would have liked to join, really wanted to join us today. And speculation is, of course, rampant that Trump is experiencing the early signs of dementia, that he had a moment of not recognizing the person next to him, that he just didn't remember that he spent the morning traveling on Air Force One with Melania Trump. And it's sort of, it's just very, very strange. And if you're just writing it off as a linguistic incident, then I would be just as concerned. Why can't a 71-year-old man whose only language, the only language he's ever spoken is English, why can't he speak in a more normal way?
But remember, Barack Obama gave a fist bump to his wife, Michelle. Some would call that a terrorist fist bump.
It was a terrorist fist jab, yeah. And that's really what we should be focusing on. And if he had done it while wearing a tan suit and discussing a serious issue, then that could have been the end of his presidency. Could have been impeachment. We are on Reddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit to discuss this or any other stories from the show that are important to you there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Ken Caldeira, who's a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Sciences, Department of Global Ecology, also professor by courtesy in the Stanford University Department of Earth System Science. We've been talking, Ken, about many different aspects of how the climate on our planet is changing. And one of those that I've mentioned a few times now is the acidification of our oceans. Let's start with what that means and why this is a relevant area of study when we think about climate change.
When we burn coal, oil, or gas, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But over time, most of that carbon dioxide will get absorbed by the ocean. And this is a problem because when carbon dioxide reacts with seawater, it becomes carbonic acid. And in high enough concentrations, the carbonic acid can dissolve the shells and skeletons of marine organisms. And even in the lower concentrations that we're expecting this century, it can make it more difficult for marine organisms to grow their shells and skeletons. And this is likely to be devastating for some marine ecosystems, and we're unsure what it will do to other marine ecosystems.
What's our basis for measurement? In other words, if we say, well, the oceans are more acidic, how is that measured? Sort of what's the scale? And how much of a change are we seeing in terms of the level of acidity?
Scientists measure something called pH, which is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration or activity in the ocean. And so what's really important is how much the different chemical species are changing, especially the building blocks with which marine organisms build their shells and skeletons. And so since the pre-industrial time, so before the Industrial Revolution, that maybe the concentration of hydrogen ions has gone up something like 30%. And this means also that some of the building blocks that marine organisms to build their shells and skeletons have gone down by 30%. But more or less, it goes opposite to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So if atmospheric CO2 doubles, some of the essential building blocks that marine organisms need to build their shells gets cut in half. And this is going to have big impacts, especially for coral reefs and other ecosystems that depend on these sort of hard, bony structures.
Yeah, and before we dig more into that, just to get to get this talking point out of the way before we go further, if somebody hears you say compared to the pre-industrial revolution, and they say, well, the tools we had then are nothing like the tools we have now for doing this kind of science, how do we know what the levels were prior to the Industrial Revolution? The answer is what?
Yes, as you point out, the biological effects are uncertain, but the chemical effects are well known. And that's because we do things with fancy models, but you don't need fancy models. You could take a bucket of seawater and put it under a bell jar and change the CO2 concentrations of the overlying gases in that bell jar, and then look at the chemistry of the seawater and see how it changes. And so the chemistry of how carbon dioxide affects seawater is extremely well understood. And there are a number of indicators of what chemistry were in the past. We can see where shells were forming in the past. But the main thing is you don't need any fancy models. You can just put a bucket of seawater under different concentrations of CO2 and see how the chemistry changes. So the chemical changes are well understood and well known, but the biological effects are highly uncertain in many cases.
So let's talk through now the sort of successive impact on the ecosystem. The water becomes more acidic. this impacts, as you've mentioned, all sorts of coral reefs significantly, but also, if I understand correctly, crustaceans and other sea life as well?
Yes, I have a postdoc working with me who's looking at how ocean acidification affects the larval stages of sea urchins, and it inhibits their growth. Similar experiments have been done on oyster larvae and many other marine organisms. It seems that often it's the larval stages that are most sensitive, because if you think of adults are better able to control their environment, but these little larvae with just a few cells in them are very sensitive to changes in ocean chemistry, and that's when they're needing to build a lot of their hard bony parts, and they're having more trouble doing it in more acidic oceans.
And what would be some of the possible subsequent effects of this on the broader ocean ecosystem and then even of the entire planet?
A lot of my study has been focused on coral reefs, and that's kind of the easiest system to understand what's going on, because one type of organism builds the very architecture of that ecosystem, and we know that if hard, stony corals disappear, that coral reef ecosystem is going to disappear. So we've done experiments showing that ocean chemistry influences the rate at which the corals can grow their skeletons. And if we project forward from our experiments, we would conclude that sometime in a few decades, nearly all the coral reefs in the world are likely to be in a net eroding, losing mass. And once those coral reefs lose enough of that calcium carbonate stony material, the reef won't be able to survive. Now, we know we've also done work along the California coastal system, and we know that the larvae of many of the marine organisms that live along the California coast are sensitive to ocean acidification, but it's a very complicated ecosystem, and it's unknown if you start toying with creatures near the base of the food chain, how is that going to affect the entire ecosystem? It's impossible to conduct a real experiment on that. And so I think we can expect that big changes will come, but exactly what those changes will be are hard to predict.
You've talked a little bit about sort of what maybe solutions or mitigating activities might be for this problem. One of the things I've seen you say would not be particularly useful, at least as far as ocean acidification is concerned, is sort of solar geoengineering, right? We sometimes hear about reflecting some portion of sunlight back into space to counteract warming of the Earth, but that, you've said specifically with the issue you study, wouldn't really make a difference because you're talking about CO2 content on Earth, right?
Yes. Carbon dioxide has both chemical effects and physical effects on Earth's radiation balance or Earth's climate system. And so even if you could somehow correct the climate effects of carbon dioxide, we'd still be stuck with the chemical effects. Now, we did, on a small patch of reef, do an experiment where we threw an antacid into the seawater and neutralized some of that carbon acidity, and showed that the coral reef grew faster under those circumstances. But this would be impractical to do at a huge scale. So I could imagine somebody trying to protect a little marine sanctuary in a bay somewhere through these kind of approaches, and it would be very expensive and difficult. But to do something the size of the Great Barrier Reef, I think it's just not feasible.
So what are more feasible, or at least conceptually so, ways that we could work on this issue?
Well, there are two main things we need to be doing. One is we need to be transforming our energy system into one that does not rely on using the sky and the oceans as a waste dump for our carbon dioxide pollution. And so this means building, renewable energy systems and perhaps nuclear systems and so on. The other main thing we need to do is try to relieve as many other stressors on marine ecosystems as possible. Marine ecosystems are not only subject to ocean acidification, but also, as we pointed out, to global warming, coastal pollution, overfishing. pesticide runoff, and so on. And so the more we can relieve these other stressors on marine systems, the more resilient they're likely to be to ocean acidification.
Very, very important issue, one we will also touch on with Elizabeth Colbert, who is going to be on the program, who interviewed you extensively, it seems like anyway, for her
Yes.
book, The Sixth Extinction.
She came with us on one of our experiments to the coral reef to some coral reef in the Great Barrier Reef in
That's right.
Australia, and it was great to have her there.
Absolutely fascinating. We've been speaking with Ken Caldeira, climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Science's Department of Global Ecology. Ken, thanks a lot for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So, as you probably know, Trump Care 1.0 failed, Trump Care 2.0 failed, and then last week we learned about Trump Care 3.0, probably the most depraved and disgusting version of all of these Obamacare repeal and replace ideas. Over 30 million people expected to end up without health care if this bill were to pass, which includes not only a repeal of most aspects of Obamacare, it also adds this vulture capitalist provision where for-profit insurance companies can squeeze even more money out of people, especially people with pre-existing conditions or people who get sick after getting insurance, and of course out of seniors, often on fixed incomes. And it seemed like this had a real shot at passing, but then we learned over the weekend that Republican John McCain wasn't having it. We learned that Republican Senator Rand Paul wasn't in favor for the wrong reasons, right? But still, he was against it. And it was not looking good all of a sudden for Trump Care 3.0. So now Republicans in the Senate have made some changes to try to once again ram this thing through by September 30th, needing only 51 votes instead of the 60 that they would need after that date. And one of these revisions that Republicans have made is basically a bribe to some of the states, including the state of Alaska. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski is one of the no's. She was one of the bigly publicized no's from last time, right? And she is set to be a no this time once again. And Alaska, as well as Arizona and Kentucky, would get more federal funding for Medicaid and other healthcare provisions. In the original version of Trump Care 3.0, those states were going to see declines in funding. So first of all, I believe the term bribe is completely correct here. This is a gift of money meant to persuade someone else to act in one's favor. You weren't going to vote for it because your state was going to get reduced funding. Well, here's some money for you so that now you'll vote for it in favor of taking money away from other people who aren't getting what I would call a sweetheart deal as a result of one of these bribes. I think that the term bribe is very accurate here.
Yeah, especially because it was a long shot and everyone knew that. And while Lisa Murkowski, and also you can throw in Susan Collins in there as well, everyone assumed that they weren't going to vote for this bill because of the same objections that they had to the last ones. That
very similar.
There's no pre-existing conditions coverage guaranteed, and that it would cancel the Medicaid expansion. So you can kind of assume that they were on the same boat as Rand Paul and John McCain.
Yeah.
Republicans are trying to do whatever they can to make sure that at least it has a chance.
Yeah, and the reason why at first glance it seemed like this thing had way more support is because the threshold for passage was 51 instead of 60. So it's not that the bill drastically changed. It's not that tons of people who were opposed to it now are in favor of it. It's that the threshold was 51. 51 votes was it. And this also, when you think about this money, right, that's being offered to these other states, this means that the bill sucks, but that Republicans are fine voting for it. They don't actually need the money. The Republicans who are not receiving a bribe, you can argue, are just as immoral as the ones that might be receiving it, because they're saying, yeah, this is going to crush health funding for many health programs in my state, but I'm fine with it. I don't even need a bribe. I don't care about the healthcare repercussions. I care about the political optics, and they want to be able to check off, hey, we repealed Obamacare. That's arguably as bad as getting the bribe, the fact that they don't care what the health outcomes are in their states.
And I don't feel like John McCain, who is one of the key votes on this, is going to be susceptible to it,
I hope
because
not.
even if he does survive this bout with brain cancer, this is going to be his last term in the Senate. So does he really want this to be his legacy, especially when he called for going back to regular order and having a procedure of going through hearings and committees and all this stuff?
I hope not. I really hope not. And there are some senators like John McCain and Lisa Murkowski who seem to be saying, hey, let me evaluate the actual repercussions of this bill on the people in my state, and I'm going to decide what to do based on that. And then you have Republicans coming to them and saying, hey, we'll exempt your state from the crushing funds reduction so that you'll agree to do the bill, but your state is going to get more money for healthcare programs. That is not government for the people. This is the furthest thing from government for the people. And a really funny but also really scary moment around this was on Fox News Sunday yesterday about pre-existing conditions. We know that people with pre-existing conditions could easily end up paying more if Trump Care 3.0 were to pass. And Fox News' Chris Wallace got the White House Director of Legislative Affairs, Mark Short, to admit that, yeah, some people might pay more if they have pre-existing conditions, after really making him flummox. Here's just a minute of video from yesterday's Fox News Sunday. And the guy, it seems like he kind of has no choice but to admit that, yeah, you might pay more if you have pre-existing conditions under Trump Care 3.0.
That's a loophole big enough to drive a tank through.
Chris, those are two separate questions. Do you want Washington, D.C. choosing the rates all across the nation for all sorts of factors? That's a different question than guaranteeing pre-existing conditions. The bill guarantees pre-existing conditions.
No, it doesn't.
You're correct.
No, it doesn't. It just says that they have to, forgive me, sir, it says that all they have to do is get a federal waiver that they have adequate and affordable coverage without ever explaining what adequate and affordable coverage is. That's not a guarantee.
Adequate and affordable coverage will be guaranteed to every one of those states that apply.
But what's the definition of adequate and affordable, and what does it mean when a state can raise premiums?
That is a separate question. And do you want Washington, D.C. dictating across the country what those rates are for everybody, regardless of conditions?
What good is insurance coverage if you can't afford to buy it?
Because you're also providing additional financial support to those states so they can make sure that those rates stay low for all different individuals and all different classes, including those with pre-existing conditions, Chris.
Well, there is no statement as to how much that's going to be. And in fact, it says states can raise premiums for coverage for pre-existing conditions without any guidelines. There's no question it's going to be higher in some states than it is under Obamacare.
There's going to be some states higher, some states lower, Chris. Do you want Washington, D.C. sitting...
So if you got pre-existing conditions in a state where it's higher, you're out of luck.
No, you're not necessarily out of luck, Chris.
You're not necessarily out of luck. That means Chris Wallace is right. And this is the truth, right? You can repeat the talking points, and Mark Short is good at repeating the talking points. Do you want the government deciding what rates are going to be all over the country? Do you want for-profit insurance companies deciding that they're going to raise the prices on people with pre-existing conditions? It's a question of what you want. That he's right about, and it really depends on your philosophy as to whether health insurance is supposed to be operating in a free market where people can decide, well, this is like a product, whether you can or can't afford it, it's like a new luxury sedan. Or is health insurance something that we need to say, no, it's not supply and demand in the free market. We need to treat it differently.
And actually, that debate's going to happen tonight on CNN. Graham and Cassidy are going to argue in favor of their bill against Amy Klobuchar, Democrat, and Bernie Sanders, obviously opposed to it as well.
Yep.
But is it really a good political move, I wonder? Because I think they're flailing on their own. They don't need someone arguing in favor of keeping the Affordable Care Act and even going further to smash it into the ground.
It strikes me, the debate, it sort of strikes me as just political theater, because whether or not it passes in 2 days or however many days it's going to be is not really going to depend on the opinions of people who watch the debate on CNN tonight. And I love that we're having this debate. I think it's great to have the debate. But the truth is, we know what the repercussions will be. So the only influence that the debate could have is if people fall for the optics of what is said to defend the bill.
Right, seeing it on an even platform as if these ideas are just as good as one another.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it could raise poll numbers for this bill, if it's argued that it's going to help out the states and, it's less government interference, and those poll number increases could translate to more votes.
It's possible. I'm so skeptical about it. I'm just so skeptical that that's going to happen. But I'm going to watch the debate. I think it'll be interesting. As far as Rand Paul, I mentioned Rand Paul is opposed to the bill. He's opposed to it because he opposes the block grant system, and for different reasons than I think the block grants are a terrible idea. I think the block grants are a terrible idea because they're going to be smaller than the amount of subsidies that Obamacare has, and they're not going to work as well. But I'll take Rand Paul's opposition, right? It's not the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's not Rand Paul is a great progressive voice. It's just if Rand Paul is one of the votes that prevents this from becoming the law, then that's absolutely fine. The message is don't stop contacting your senators. We don't know what will happen yet. They're coming for your health care. Keep calling your elected officials. But her emails, we've heard it endless times. Hillary Clinton used a private email server. You can't do that. She's bad. She's not trustworthy. Trump can be trusted. He's the savior. He'll drain the swamp. He'll put the best people around him, and it'll be totally transparent. It'll all be great. But the truth is that lots of people in Trump's circle use private email before their involvement with the Trump campaign, during it, and after as well. Vice President Mike Pence used a private email server. Congressman Jason Chaffetz did the same thing. Chris Kobach used a private email account while on Trump's voter suppression commission. Senior Trump administration staffers like Kellyanne Conway, Sean Spicer, Steve Bannon, they had private email. We now have learned that the golden boy, Jared Kushner, one of Donald Trump's closest advisors and really one of the most influential team members on everything from foreign policy to domestic policy, he's been using private email to conduct White House business. This was not some old email address that he kept using after the election. This is a new private email account that Jared Kushner set up after the election in December of 2016. This isn't a private email that he was just using for private business. Jared Kushner has been using his new private email account for White House business and for government business after the election of Donald Trump. There are 4 people familiar with some of the emails that Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, wrote and received on his private email address. They spoke to Politico. Politico looked at dozens of those emails. They confirmed they are exactly as described. And as usual, the defense initially is, this barely happened, and it doesn't matter, and we shouldn't be concerned. That's always stage one until more evidence leaks. Jared Kushner's lawyer said Mr. Kushner uses his White House email address to conduct White House business. Fewer than 100 emails from January to August were either sent to or returned by Mr. Kushner to colleagues in the White House from his personal email account. These usually forwarded news articles or political commentary, and most often occurred when someone initiated the exchange by sending an email to his personal rather than his White House address. So what are they saying? Nothing serious was discussed. It was under 100 emails. It was mostly people sending him stuff, not him choosing to communicate with other people. Obvious question. Well, what security measures were in place? Because, of course, after learning from the lessons of Hillary Clinton's email scandal, I'm sure that anybody who uses private email would have major server security, cybersecurity in place, right? Well, Kushner's representatives were asked about that. They're declining to say what security measures were in place for his private email. And of course, this isn't anything like what Hillary Clinton did because, hey, there's a black guy kneeling during the national anthem. Look at that instead of talking about this.
Yeah, and I really don't think that this is an issue in and of itself, aside from the hypocrisy. Like, maybe just shows some negligence, and who knows what Kushner's up to.
Yeah.
But as long as we don't argue that he used a private email server, therefore there was something untoward and he should be fired from his job, then I think our slate's clean. You know what I'm saying?
Colin Powell talked about the fact that he also had private email when he was Secretary of State. He said that very, very early in the Hillary Clinton email scandal. It's not about the thing itself. It's about the stunning hypocrisy around the thing. And of course, it was never really about Hillary Clinton's emails. It was about finding an attack that would stick no matter how unhinged it was. And for a while it was Benghazi, and eventually that went away with most people, but the email stuff stuck. How does Jared Kushner still have a security clearance? And if we're asking that question, why is Jared Kushner still working at the White House, given what it is that he's been involved in? We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to this voicemail that came in.
Hey, David. This is Nick from Connecticut. I've been a member of the show for a couple years now, and I was just watching an episode this week where you read a letter from a viewer named Christy. Yeah, I pretty much make minimum wage myself, and I've been a level 2 donator to the show for a while, and then when you had the YouTube problem, I removed my Patriot 40 discount and talked my sister into a membership as well, and I donate on Patreon, and precisely for that reason, because you provide a public service, man. You should be funded by the government for what you do. So thanks a lot. Keep up the good work, Josh. Thanks.
Yeah. So a lot of reaction. I once told you a couple weeks ago now that someone once wrote to me saying, I like your show, but I'm not going to pay for it because I don't want to fund your bachelor lifestyle when I have a family. And I responded, I think a better way to decide what programs to support are the programs worthy of support in your estimation. And we heard from that single mom last week saying she's a member because she believes it's important to fund the show. We heard from this caller who earns minimum wage but says he finds the program worthy of support. And I really hope that that's the question people will ask when they say, do I want to support this? Not, is David a bachelor versus what's my situation or whatever. If you can afford it, is the program worthy of support? That's really the key question.
Yeah, especially because I don't think we're going to get any of those government grants that the caller suggested. But hey, give that man a raise. You know, he needs it.
If Mitt Romney wanted to take funding away from Big Bird, I don't know that the David Pakman Show has federal funds coming to it anytime soon. We've got a great bonus show for you today. DavidPakman.com/membership will get you instant access. A Patreon contribution of $5 at patreon.com/David Pakman Show will also get you instant access to the bonus show. We will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.